I'm going to talk again about how the DNA communicates with us. So a part of this is that I'm using personality as a metaphor. I'm assigning a personality to DNA, and I'm not saying scientifically it really has one or thinks that way, but I am saying it's pretty apt because, you know, the DNA has something to do with humanness. The DNA is you know, changing over time. The DNA creates us. The DNA wants to survive, to survive. And so I think it's a fairly apt thing. Now, I said in that case that the genes were manipulating us, and this is like this idea of the selfish gene, the book The Selfish Gene, which, no, I haven't read. A lot of people brought up. I am familiar with it, and I'm taking that as a basis. You know, the word manipulation's a little negative, and that's unfortunate. You know, it's worth using sometimes because we want to emphasize, we want to point out how the best interest of the DNA is not exactly the same thing as the best interest of humans, and yet it's funny because our best interests are so intertwined. So we both need each other to survive in the long term, right? But if we look at just an instant of an individual's life, well, I mean, the DNA needs us a lot more than we need the DNA, because we don't necessarily have to be that thankful that the DNA put us here on the planet, especially those of us that might have a negative view of what it's like to be alive, you know, that it sucks or something. But even if we're happy with being alive, it's like, okay, I'm alive, you know, what have you done for me lately? We're already alive. We don't have to repay the gratitude to the DNA by letting the DNA create, you know, more life, and we procreate and give our energy to that. So the DNA needs us more than we need it. So this is the sense in which it's sort of manipulative. And I wanted to look at how this communication works, though, because ultimately I don't see it as manipulative in a very negative sense. I want to help the DNA. I want to continue to survive through my children and this kind of thing, which is really the DNA surviving. So I have a common, you know, I feel a kinship to this DNA. And I don't really want to make it a big conflict. But I do want to look at how the desires are different. So the thing is basically this. The DNA would want us to take a big picture and help the survival of our race. But it can't rely on that. It knows that we're going to be born, and that throughout history we didn't even know about the DNA. And we can easily have our own individual needs and just seek out those and not procreate, not serve the DNA. Maybe we don't want to get, at the burden of a child, you know. And so the DNA almost seems to know this, or at least to have worked around it. Again, not necessarily literally with a thought process that made it, you know, realize this, but still the material equivalent. So rather than rely that we will just make decisions to procreate and do what the DNA wants, or even what we particularly want, it's like, because an individual could be really lazy. Let's say I'm hungry, I'm dying of starvation, or not hungry, but I'm dying of malnutrition. If I don't feel hunger, you know, my selfish individual thing might be that I don't really want to go get food, and I end up dying. And the DNA, though, gives us this hunger mechanism, which is really hard to impossible to ignore, just like with procreation. You know, instead of convincing us that we should procreate for some big picture view, it gives us lust, and we really end up not having much of a choice. The DNA is exploiting our individualistic nature by giving us individualistic urges that then serve the DNA. And I think that's fine. I think we should look at that. We should realize that one way or another, that we should be thankful to the DNA for giving us, you know, our existence in the first place. We should embrace that. We should try to find out ways to do what the DNA needs to do. Take that view on ourselves, so it's something we believe we need to do, and then that's enlightenment. You know, the DNA in that sense wants us to be enlightened. And I think that there's likely that spiritual experiences are part of the DNA's way of getting us to have an expanded view. Because if you're really enlightened, then a tragedy halfway around the world does feel personal, you know? You don't want to see that because you have this big view. And that is enlightened, and it also happens to be a joining of these individual needs with the genetic needs. It's a way so that so instead of us being in combat, the genes versus the individual, where the gene's trying to manipulate you into having babies and doing what it wants, and you're trying to get out of all of that so you can just live free and enjoy, enjoy the cheese or whatever. Having an enlightened point of view is where these things come back together and they're integrated, and suddenly, yeah, I do care about other people's children, not just my children. And I do care about other individuals. And I do care, and I do recognize that I have relationships with them. And I do realize that survival is a long-term thing. It's not just about me being alive, it's about my children and my children's children being alive. When you start to see this sort of thing, I don't feel manipulated, but I do feel that this is what, the DNA would want of me, is to understand these things and look at these things in this open-minded, enlightened way. And I think it works out rather well, so that as we start to learn things, so for example, we understand lust well enough, and we invented contraception so that we could go ahead and give in to our lust and still not give in to the DNA's purpose for that lust. That's going to work out fine if we do other things as well, like get a sustainable future. And then when people do want to have children, acknowledging that not every individual has to do that, but as a whole we can work together. Maybe if you don't have children, you might still be paying taxes to educate other people's children. Well, that's the enlightened frame. That's so that in terms of the whole genetic family, we can all make progress. And yeah, as I say, I think that works out very well. We're not in combat with the DNA, and to the degree that we think we are, we need to get enlightened frames of reference, understand where all the parts of this equation are coming from, and take a positive approach to it.